In this video, I will be making my most expensive epoxy table. I'll use some dangerous techniques, save a lot of money, and end up making my best table yet. Please enjoy. About a year ago, I bought a bunch of wood from a shady wood dealer in a small town in Hungary. And this is the project that I've been dreading and have been excited for the most in my table building experience. The first step in figuring out what I want to do with these pieces of wood is to put them together the way they were when they were a tree. And that's easier said than done. It's basically a hardcore jigsaw puzzle for all three segments of this tree. After figuring out where everything goes, I'm left with this awesome slab of mulberry. I've never heard of mulberry before, but I bought these slabs of wood because I think that they look really interesting, kind of like an olive tree. Anyways, I wanted to put together another segment to figure out which one I wanted to try my luck with first. So I weighed my options and eventually I decided on this darker color. I have a bunch of options where I can go from here. I can make a round table, that would be probably the most convenient since these are kinda round, or I can make a square table out of them and cut off the sides, and that could look cool. I can do some weird things with glass, but the first step in any of these processes is going to be to clean up these slabs of wood. And I mean really clean them up, because they are in a rough shape. Basically, all the lumber that I brought from this guy had a char on the outside, and I'm not sure why he did this, but the wood was dried out, so I could get to work on it. But I really wanted to remove this rotted and charred layer because I didn't quite fancy the look of it. So I got out my drill and inserted a wire brush and went at the outside layers. And as you can see, this method makes quick work of all the outside rot and char that was on this piece, and it cleans up real nice. This is quite important from an epoxy standpoint, because if I want to pour epoxy into a table that has these loose or dusty pieces on the outside, then they would float up in the epoxy, and I really wouldn't want that. So I employed a screwdriver and pried at the sides to knock anything that was loose out of the wood. These two pieces of wood looked really suspicious because there were two gloops of hot glue in the middle of them, and after prying at it with a screwdriver, they just popped apart. And as you can see, there's definitely some glue on there. So this guy probably tried to do something with these slabs of wood, but ended up abandoning the project. So here I am once again, picking up the pieces and trying my luck at someone's abandoned project. Anyways, what my plan is for this table is definitely going to involve epoxy. I know a lot of people don't like that, but I think that epoxy is getting a bit more recognition these days. It's a difficult, but I think a beautiful method of making tables. The first step that I'm going to employ is going to stop the degradation of the wood. So I want to seal every single edge, every single surface with a thin layer of epoxy. The epoxy that I'm using has a really long setting time. It has two components which need to be mixed in equal parts, and then you basically smear it on the wood and leave it for 5 days to soak in and to set up. This is an advantage because if I had used something like a tabletop epoxy which sets up in about a day, then all the air that is trapped inside of the pores of the wood would just basically sit there, and it would end up looking quite bubbly, and that is really not what I want. And I had to find this out the hard way and had to learn it the hard way. I heard some people on YouTube talking about it, but I kind of didn't believe it and didn't care. But now I care. Yeah. I don't want to ruin a project again, and I don't want to do a lot of sanding to remove those bubbles. So anyway, after waiting 5 days and letting the epoxy dry, I took these off the plastic film and I was left with a beautifully sealed slab of mulberry tree. I had a lot of different layouts in mind, but eventually I ended up with a circular table that I really liked. I don't want to completely engulf this table in epoxy, so I want some wood to show on the sides. This is a look that I don't see that often, And it's probably because it's quite difficult to get that waterfall edge, especially on a curved surface. But I was feeling confident, so I gave it a shot. Anyways, you can see me making a circular blank that is going to be the exact size of my finished table. I'm making this out of 2mm MDF sheet, which is going to be the perfect material for my template. First, I'm gonna roughly cut it to size with my jigsaw, and after doing this, I noticed that the edges were way too fuzzy, and that is probably because I didn't use the correct jigsaw blade. But it looked pretty circular, so I thought that it was going to be okay. But after taking a look at the edges, yeah, I wasn't gonna be able to use this. So I set up a method that is super dangerous. There are a couple of videos on YouTube on guys losing their fingers using this method. So I was super duper careful when putting this on my table saw and pivoting it around a nail. I know that it doesn't look dangerous, but if your hand slips and the table turns by itself because of the table saw, then it can kind of suck your hands in and you can easily end up losing a digit. That I really didn't want, and thankfully I managed to do it without any problems. As you can see, I basically have beginner tools, so I do not have an industrial workshop. I'm working from my parents' garage, and I have a table saw, I have a jigsaw, I have a router, but no router table, no huge miter saws, no anything that can get through this thick wood, except my trusty Japanese handsaw. So I'm going to approximate a curve and cut off a tangential line on the edge of the wood. Then I'm going to go in with my rasp and rough in the curve. This is obviously not going to be perfect, but it's gonna be good enough to make an epoxy mold around. And this way I can postpone the thinking that I would have to do to figure out how to cut this into a circular shape. But I will have to solve this eventually. If you have any suggestions on how I should do it, then please leave them in the comment section down below. You will get to see my solution in the end of the video. There are many places that the table building process can go wrong when you're using epoxy. And this one that is coming up, the mold making process, is one of the most important. The time you invest here, you save tenfold on the cleanup process. For example, this sticky tape. This is a special type of tape that is coated in a small layer of wax that makes the epoxy not stick to it. And this is super important if you want to remove the mold from the bottom of the wood. And if you've seen my previous video, then you know I've learned this lesson on my own skin once again. After coating the entire bottom of the mold in this sticky tape, I cut out these segments of MDF to make the sides out of. And in this one I opted to use duct tape because it also had to be structurally sound, and that other sticky tape really wasn't that strong, so duct tape it is. The idea was that I would stitch together 3 of these and then wrap it around my ring mold, and this would make a perfect 10 cm border that I can pour epoxy into. I expected this to go smoothly, but I spent a couple hours doing this and just trying to get the size right, trying to get the fit right, and not break any piece of MDF. This is actually the 4th of these ring molds that I've made, because I've broken all other ones. Yeah, this radius is pretty much at the limit that this MDF can handle, and my stitches were bulging out on the sides, so I couldn't get an accurate measurement initially. But after messing around with it for a while, I eventually managed to get a good measurement and I cut it down to size. I left a bit of overhang just as a safety precaution, and after another couple hours I managed to bend the ring once again around the table mold. The next step was to seal everything up with a metric ton of sealant. I opted to use an acrylic sealant instead of a silicone one, because this tape really doesn't like to stick to silicone, and I've experienced some leaks before using that. The keen-eyed among you may notice that I didn't apply this non-stick tape to the ring itself, only the bottom half. And I wanted to play this off as a conscious decision, but I just forgot. And yeah, I'm going to suffer for it later. But finally, everything is set in order, and now it's time to pour some epoxy. All my silicone has dried up, so I'm going to place the ring mold down. If you're wondering what those pieces of wood under it are, I intentionally left a rim for air to pass under the table because I was worried that it would get too hot and I wanted to add some ventilation. Now, after putting the jigsaw puzzle together once again, I was ready for the next step, which is to seal the underside of the table and to make sure that everything is stuck down. I don't want any piece of wood to float up to the top and to leave a gap or become an uneven surface. So that's why I used even more sealant and managed to save some epoxy in the long run. And yes, this time I am using silicone because I don't want these to stick on permanently and I want them to come off easily from the sticky tape. After applying all my body weight to all of these pieces, the table was stuck down and I was finally ready to pour some epoxy. And oh boy, was I going to pour a lot of epoxy. I know this is nothing crazy that you haven't seen before on YouTube, but for me, this breaks the bank. I really cannot afford the table like this, and I want to sell them eventually in the long run. I haven't had that much luck in selling these tables, but I'm going to keep trying. So I invested some more cash into buying some epoxy. This is the high-end stuff, and I'm going to try to make it work. This may be insanely unnecessary, but I have a really complicated approach to this table. First, I mixed up about a liter of this super clear high gloss epoxy, which I'm going to pour onto the bottom. And this is going to add some more sealant, and if the wood sucks it up, then that's going to be pretty much okay. This is it gummed up, and I'm going to pour the second layer colored a deep black. Firstly, because I just love the look of black epoxy mixed with some light colored tables, and secondly, because I have a trick up my sleeve to save some epoxy. In case you didn't know, this stuff costs a lot of money. Not the paint I mean, but the epoxy itself. If you can save a little, it means a lot in money terms. Basically, what I want to do is embed some other wooden pieces that are not as costly as this one inside of the table, and I can achieve this by hiding them between two layers of black epoxy. If you cannot see through the black epoxy and you put in some wood pieces, then that can take up some volume which will not be taken up by the resin itself. So that's the plan. First I poured a non-transparent layer. As you can see, if I shine my phone at it, you cannot see the bottom side, and that is what I want. And then, after letting it dry, I can fill these gaps up with some wooden pieces. First, I'm gonna take some measurements with my caliper and see how big I need to cut these wooden segments that are going to fill up these cracks. Then I'm pretty much just going to find some junk lumber that I have. Obviously it's not completely junk, but these will do just nicely for filling up these gaps. And I think I've tuned the tolerances quite well, because I want to leave about 1 centimeter on the top so that I can fill this up with black epoxy, and that way it will be non-transparent, both from the bottom and from the top. And my secret will be completely hidden. So I cut up a bunch of these wood pieces, organized them, and started filling up the table. This was quite a fun process, although a bit tedious. After about an hour's worth of work, I managed to fill up the entire table with these wooden pieces. Obviously there are still some gaps left, and these are important because they serve a structural purpose. But I can't have these wooden dowels flopping around inside of these cracks, so I'm going to hot glue them to the bottom layer of epoxy. Now, hot glue in this aspect is okay, because it doesn't really serve a structural purpose. It only serves for the purpose of fixing these in until I pour some epoxy onto them, and hopefully fixing them in long enough so that they don't float to the top as the epoxy is drying. Now I've created a lot of dust and a lot of fragments of small chunks of wood, and I cannot have that, so I vacuumed them up and scaled up the operation. I mixed up a bucket load of epoxy and poured it into the table. And if I'm guessing right, I saved about $200 with these wooden pieces added in. But it's still a question if they will work, if they will show on the other side. Hopefully not. But I'm pretty confident that this will work. If you have been following along this channel a long time, then I thank you for watching this video very much, because I managed to reach 2,500 followers on YouTube, and that is a huge deal for me. And if you're new here, I thank you very much for watching, and if you would like to see more of this type of content, then please do subscribe to the channel, because I have some videos that I have been waiting to upload for a long time now. And in my humble opinion, it's awesome stuff, so you wouldn't want to miss it. In case you are wondering why I haven't uploaded for such a long time, even though I kept it pretty consistent up to this point, it's because I had a lot of personal stuff going on in my life and I just couldn't find the time for YouTube. But now everything is back in its rightful place, and I have a job, I have a new car, I moved out of my parents' basement. Yeah, pretty much everything in my life has turned upside down, but no worries, I'm doing fine. And I will keep making YouTube videos as long as I feel like it, because it's kind of a fun little hobby of mine, and yeah, I just want to continue it and see the channel grow, see the community grow, and hopefully learn a lot more about making. But back to the topic at hand. As you can see, I've managed to remove the bottom of this table mold quite easily, but the sides look horrendous. The bottom, obviously there's a bunch of silicone that I've put on there, and on a couple of pieces the silicone has not worked and the epoxy has leaked under the table pieces. But thankfully nothing floated up to the top and the surface is quite even. So what I need to do next is to get my router jig and level out the top surface and make it ready for sanding. I could use sanding for the entire top, but that would take way too long and I just don't have that kind of time. So I made this router jig a couple videos back, and this speeds up the process a lot. Here are the two finished table sides, and as you can see, I've had some burn-ins, I've had some minor imperfections, but all in all I think it looks great. There are a couple of spots where the epoxy didn't reach the top, so I'm going to have to backfill these, but that will come later. For now, let's get the belt sander out and let's get to work. Even though I've said this is a hobby of mine, this part is definitely the work part, because I really don't like sanding that much, and yeah, I have to do a lot of sanding. I don't mean that I hate it, because I'm still making something beautiful and it's a part of the process that I just cannot skip, but it would be really beneficial to skip this part. It is terrible on the lungs, it is terrible on the ears, and it is really boring. But after a while, I managed to sand everything up to 80 grit. Next, I found the center of the table and put in a drill bit as a kind of axle, which I can use to finally finish the sides. As I've said before, this is quite a difficult challenge, and this is the super janky solution that I came up with. I have this plunge router and it's going to rotate around the center of the table and take off the side. Yeah, really janky, and hopefully nothing goes wrong and I can get this right first try. I was confident in myself that I could do this, because even if I messed it up, I could just take off a bit of the diameter of the table and try again. So I took my time and I went around both sides of the table, and eventually I managed to end up with something that looks quite good in my opinion. Check it out. It's far from perfect, but it looks really great. If you run your hand along the entire perimeter of the table, you can feel a couple of bumps, but I think that's alright. It's kind of a rustic style anyways, and I'm going to be able to correct these in the finish sanding process. But before I can get to finishing, I need to fix all these tiny mistakes that are in the wood. And these are basically tiny buck holes or anything that didn't fill up with epoxy. So I'm just mixing up a very small batch, pouring it into a drip bottle, and then taking my time to fill in every single small crack, crevice, and anything that is looking weird. Thankfully, the wood didn't have that many imperfections, but still I need to fix everything quite prudently because the end result will depend on how much effort and how much time I put into this step. So I make sure to take my time and fill every single hole. After that, I'm going to let it dry for 5 days and then come back with my orbital sander for the finish sanding process. I'm not going to bore you with all the sanding, but I'm still going to show some of it so you can see what I'm actually doing. At first I go in with an aggressive 100 grit and then move over to 180 and then 240. And that is pretty much ready for finish. The finish I'm going to be using recommends that I sand it up to only 180, but I like to take it a bit further to give it that extra shine. This is one of the most monotone processes that are in the table building process. You basically sand down with one grit, pop the grain with some water, dry it down, and then go in with a finer grit. And it's important to take your time and to get out every single scratch that was left by the previous grit, because when you apply the finish, it will definitely show through. So that's one side pretty much finished. Let's move on to the other one. For that, I'm going to have to flip this table. And I didn't mention this before, but this table weighs about 40 kilograms, so it's quite heavy. And that's why you can see me jiggling it around, but it works. That's the other side done as well, so now I can finally move on to the sides. I've tried using my orbital sander to sand the sides down, but it really didn't work. The sandpaper just fell off the Velcro that is on the underside of my sander. So I had to use some hand sanding methods. And yeah, this takes way more time and it is extremely exhausting if you do it for like half an hour, but at least I got a good workout in. I put a tiny radius by hand on the sides of the table because I really enjoyed this aggressive cylindrical shape that the table had. Now I can finally move on to finishing. I mixed up this 2-part Rubio monocoat and then went on to finishing. I didn't have time to show it in the video, but I actually cleaned the table off with some water first and then let it dry, vacuumed all the loose dust that was on the surface and then cleaned it up again with mineral spirits. Mineral spirits are important because all the nasty stuff that comes up from your fingers, like oils and whatever, can be cleaned off with mineral spirits, and it helps the finish stick better, helps the finish absorb better and more evenly. So yeah, that's pretty much it. But other than that, this product is really simple and easy to use, and the one thing that you need to pay attention to is that you need to buff it in with some kind of a sander or a polishing machine, because that will create an even shine on the top surface. After letting it absorb for around 10 minutes, I come in with a clean towel and then wipe off all the excess. This is only the first layer that I'm going to be applying, and a second layer is definitely going to be necessary because this wood is really porous. Unfortunately, on the side I don't have a polishing machine that can do this, so I'm going to have to do it by hand. And this is not optimal because the shine will be a bit inconsistent on the epoxy parts, but that's life. Nothing can be perfect, and I'm still pretty happy with the result. Usually I finish both sides of a table when I'm working on it, but today I felt quite lazy and probably had something other to do, so I finished one side, left it to dry for 2 days, and then flipped it over, cleaned up the other side, and went at it once again. I try to aim for equal quality on both sides of my tables, and I think that this side turned out better, so I'm going to use this as the top. But that doesn't mean that the underside is going to look bad, and if my customer or my future customer decides that they want to use the other side instead, then I can obviously offer them that option as well. I have already made a table base for this, but I'm not going to screw it down into the table base, just so that my customer, whenever my customer shows up, can decide which side he prefers. Now that that's done, all that's left to do is to wait for it to dry and come back with a second coat a bit later. Anyways, with that, the table is pretty much finished, so I'm gonna shut up for a sec and let you guys enjoy the beauty shots. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this type of content, then please check out my other videos. Other than that, please subscribe to the channel and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye. See ya.